Hello there, how are you doing? Today we're going to be continuing on a subject that we touched on in the last video, which is concerning the living spirit of prophecy. That was the focus of the last video. And today we're going to be looking at the term the last, or last, in the Shepherd's Rod literature. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Shepherd's Rod message, essentially it's a message that came to the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1929 and was written from 1929 till 1955 by a man named Victor Houteff. The followers or advocates of that message are known as Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, and this is addressing a particular understanding that most Davidians have. So we're going to be looking at that, and the majority of you watching this probably are Davidian, so you'll be familiar with some of these concepts. So yeah, I guess we'll just dive into it, and I'll ask you to keep an open mind and be prayerful. Alright, so first just a few principles. We have first Timely Greetings of Volume 1, Number 12, page 18. It says, "Ever have your ears open to any claimant of inspiration, if you are not to repeat the history of the Jews. God will not let you be deceived if you really hunger and thirst after righteousness, if you really want to know the truth, for He is anxious that you keep up with His progressively revealed truth. There is therefore no danger for one to be deceived by coming in contact with error, but there is a great danger for staying in darkness by not coming in contact with fresh truth." And of course, Proverbs 18:13, "He that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame unto him." Okay, so please keep these principles clearly in your mind as we continue on here. So, okay, this is basically what we'll be getting into in this study. What I have here, when you see paragraphs such as this, it is basically my comments, and this is just a little article I wrote concerning this subject, and you'll see as we go on kind of the format of how this is put together. Essentially what this is a compilation of every time in the writings of Victor Houteff that the word last is used. And I've put these statements in categories of context. And the reason for this is that there are one common belief that Davidians hold, which is that the Shepherd's Rod message is the last message to come to the church, and that Victor Houteff was the last prophet to come to the church. Now, we'll be examining that, and so for those of you who are Davidians, most of you probably hold to that concept, which is a concept that I myself held to for a while. And for those of you who are not Davidians, this might clear up a few things for you in regards to why the Davidian movement is the way it is presently. And it'll also just clear up a few things as to what it actually teaches. So again, please keep an open mind, especially, I know that it hits a few hot spots for those of you who are Davidians out there, but please, consider the quotes that we just read. Do we really want to make them the same mistakes that have been made in the past? So anyways, we'll continue on. I may not read everything that's on the screen, but we'll read the majority of it, at least. Okay, so the vast majority of Davidians believe that the Shepherd's Rod is the last message, at least to the church. This, together with the foundational teaching that the Bible cannot be privately interpreted, leaves one to conclude that from 1955, which is the date that Victor Houteff died, till the establishment of the kingdom, there are to be no more prophets and no more revelations of truth. In other words, if there's not to be any more prophets, there wouldn't be any fresh revelations of truth in a Davidian mindset, because that's the role that the prophets have. So in order to see whether or not this conclusion is correct, we must thoroughly investigate the rod, or what the rod has to say on the subject. Such a task must be done with an open mind and, yes, much prayer. So yeah, basically what we find in the most of you out there are familiar with the Shepherd's Rod Folio Base CD, and in that CD, if you type in the word last, you will get 750 hits. Now there's actually more occurrences of the word last, because within some of those hits there are more occurrences, but that's fine because all of the occurrences are contained within this compilation. In other words, there's more than 750 references in this compilation, because I made sure to include every occurrence of the word in the literature. So I give a quick illustration here of how I basically wrote down the references, and it should be pretty self-explanatory for most of you. For instance, here 1TG 36:3:1 means Timely Greetings, Volume 1, number 36, page 3, paragraph 1. So in other words, volume, and then type of or category of writing. It could be timely greeting or a tract or a symbolic code, whatever. In this case, for an example, I use timely greeting. So that's volume, and then article of literature, and then number if it is a a numbered type tract, and then we have page and paragraph, and then they're separated by semicolons, as you'll see. Okay, so this is just explaining what I just did about placing into categories. Okay, so what you see here, these are occurrences of the word last in the Shepherd's Rod literature that have absolutely nothing to do with the message itself or Victor Houteff. So you can go and check up every single one of these if you like. I'm going to have them on the screen, and I'm going to slowly scroll down so that you can see each reference. And I'll explain a little bit as to what type of context you will find if you look up these references. And if you're wondering why some of them are bolded, that's just showing that it is a new tract. So in other words, you'll see here to answer book. Then everything from this point till the next point is within answer book volume 2. So in other words, answer book volume 2, page 14, paragraph 3. Answer book, volume 2, page 15, paragraphs 2 and 3, so on and so forth. So these are the types of things that you'll find in that list of references. Within that large list that we saw, which is actually the largest list of that contextual use of the word last, within Victor Houteff's writings, you'll see many things like at last, or at long last, or to last over a year, last Sabbath, last paragraph, last part, last seal, if time should last, last Wednesday, last days. Those types of phrases which aren't relative or relevant to the subject of whether or not the Shepherd's Rod is the last message or Victor Houteff is the last prophet. So we're going to continue on to the rest of the context, and as you see, this list is much shorter as the rest of them are. So within all the references that you see in front of you here, these contain references that refer to the last call, or it's basically saying that the shepherd's rod message is the last call for laborers in the context of the parable of Matthew 20. So we'll read the comments that I have here in relation to this. And basically what we're doing is, for those of you especially who saw the last video, where we saw that Victor Houteff clearly taught that the living spirit of prophecy is the Holy Spirit working through a living prophet, and that he said that there must be the spirit of prophecy active in the church in order to have any success. Many questions arise as to, okay, well, if that's the case, how can the shepherd's rod message be the last, and how can Victor Houteff be the last prophet? And it's an issue that many people come up to. So this is basically providing an answer. So these paragraphs here are answering the typical understanding that Davidians have of these quotations that you'll find here, the ones here relevant to the 11th hour call of the parable of the laborers. So in all the above quotations, one will find that the shepherd's rod message is claiming to be the last call for laborers. To be in complete harmony with the rod, one needs to point out that the 11th hour call is said to have begun with the publication of Shepherd's Rod Volume 2, and you can find that in Shepherd's Rod Volume 2, page 9. But that later, the message clearly identified the 11th hour call as being the loud cry to the world. You can see that in Tract 8, page 59 to 60, and as well as the title of Tract 8, and Tract 12, page 34. And this presents no real problems when it is understood that the call itself is not given in a single day, or in one day, but is rather given in a prolonged period of time. The fact that the rod message claims to be the 11th hour call, the last, in no way suggests that there can be no more prophets or no more truths revealed. One way to understand this is to recognize that these calls are not 100% equivalent to messages. For instance, the 6th hour call is said to be the message of the Millerites. Yet within that message, there was the first angel's message, the second angel's message, and the midnight cry. Likewise, the 9th hour call is said to be the Adventist message, which not only included all the messages preceding it, but also the third angel's message and the message of righteousness by faith given in 1888. In other words, these calls that we see in the parable for the laborers was not restricted in any way to either any particular message or any particular prophet. In fact, it grouped messages together. So that's basically speaks for itself. These simple facts show us in a simple way that even though the rod message is the 11th hour call, there's nothing saying that the call cannot include more truth or more prophets than what we had in the years 1929 to 1955. So hopefully that's simple enough, and we'll move right on to the next category. And mind you, if any of you have any comments or questions for any of this, feel free to leave a comment below, send me a message here on YouTube, or if you're watching this on Facebook or any other medium, feel free to message me in any way. Alright, so this next set of references contains statements saying that the rod message is the last, since it concerns the great and dreadful day of the Lord, or the judgment for the living, the Elijah message. So we'll examine this here and see what it says. Okay, the above quotations are very easy to understand when we consider them in the light of the facts. The message of the judgment for the living, we are told, is the last. Not only this, but that the shepherd's rod message is the last, or is the message of the judgment for the living. Here are some facts to consider. And this is Jezreel letter number 2, page 1, paragraph 1. Dear fellow member, the only way for you to escape being taken by wolves in sheep's clothing is if you ever remember the fact that the judgment message, the last message before Christ comes the second time, is what made us a people. That is, because the message had come, and because it has to be proclaimed, we SDAs came on the scene, and we certainly want to stay there until the work is finished. We must not become a back number as did the Protestant churches, since they rejected the messages one after another. God forbid we should be spewed out and lose so late in the day. And what is the truth of the judgment? So we're about to see, I'll just point out a few things about that text. Notice here that Victor Houteff is speaking of the last message being the message which begun the SDA denomination. He refers to it doing its work in past tense. How could he say that? How could he say that the message which started the denomination is the last, and yet there still be more truth, even another message and another prophet to come? In other words, he's referring to the judgment message, the message which he says in this context begun the SDA denomination, the message that has been proclaimed since we SDAs came on the scene. He calls that message the last message before Christ comes, and yet he's saying that he has another message and that he's another prophet to follow it. So in other words, he's using the term last here in an encompassing sense. In other words, there's the judgment message, but there's more than one phase to the judgment, and we're about to see that in the following quotes. So this is now the second paragraph, the paragraph to follow. It says, and I'll just, in the context it says, and what is the truth of the judgment? The judgment, as you know, is in two separate and distinct sections, one following the other. The judgment for the dead first, and the judgment for the living last. This we know is so, and we must not let subversive influences, even if they be in Seventh-day Adventist garb, cause us to lose sight of this truth. Our part of the judgment message since 1844 has been, as you know, to proclaim the judgment for the dead, not for the living. What is the judgment for the dead? And then he continues on. But you notice here, this is the key. The judgment itself and the message of the judgment comes in sections. This is easy to comprehend when we consider that the message concerning the judgment for the dead had three main messages that came or that made up the overall message at that time. These, of course, are the first three angels' messages of Revelation 14. It is also important to note, however, that there were two more messages given in relation to the judgment for the dead, that being the midnight cry, given in the summer of 1844, and the message of righteousness by faith, given in 1888. So you can see there's actually 5 messages there given in relation to the judgment for the dead. The first, second, and third angels' messages, that's 3. The midnight cry, that's 4, and 1888, that's 5. So those are all in relation to the judgment for the dead. With these facts in view, we see irrefutable proof that even though a message be the last, that does not mean that there are no more messages and messengers within that message. For instance, the message of the investigative judgment is indeed the last. This message, though, has within itself 2 distinct sections, which in themselves can be called messages, that being the message for the judgment for the dead and the judgment for the living. These, as well as we have seen, can be divided up into more messages. The judgment for the dead message can be divided up into first angel's message, second angel's message, third angel's message, midnight cry, and the 1888 message. Now what of the judgment for the living? In other words, if we're going to say, as some, or the majority of Seventh-day Adventists do, that, well, the investigative judgment message is the last message, therefore, since 1915, there can be no more truth, no more prophets. You know, that's what they're saying, and if we're gonna, throw out this concept of, yes, there's the last message, but that message is divided into sub-messages, if we're going to throw out that concept and say, no, that can't be the case, then we'd have to throw out the shepherd's rod message itself. And not only that, but we'd have to not even accept the 1888 message because of certain statements Ellen White makes before 1888, which we'll see in a few minutes. So anyways, White House Recruiter, page 37. And this is looking at the divisions of messages within the more overall message of the judgment for the living, which itself is in the overall message of the investigative judgment. So White House Recruiter, page 37. When finally the judgment passes from the dead to the living, thus outmoding by expiration the initial phase of the first angel's message, the judgment of the dead, what timely truth will the Church then have for herself and for the world? What indeed if she does not now accept and practice the message of very present truth, the final phase of the first angel's message, which is presently announcing the stealthy approach of the judgment upon the living, and which is now knocking at each heart's door? So notice here that Victor Houteff is clearly identifying the message which he brought, the shepherd's rod message, as being the final phase of the first angel's message, which was then presently announcing the stealthy approach of the judgment for the living. So notice, just as William Miller gave his message, the first angel's message, as the judgment for the dead was approaching, just so Victor Houteff was giving his message as the judgment for the living was approaching. And clearly he's identifying it as the first angel's message. So what of the other angel's messages, as we have here? In Symbolic Code Volume 3, number 8, page 9, it says, among Adventists, the term third angel's message is understood to contain the first, second, and third angel's messages, but not so when we use the expression second angel's message. The shepherd's rod is using the term third angel's message to convey the fact that the proclamation of all three angels' messages are to be repeated, which I didn't include in this particular study, but Ellen White also says that all three angels' messages are to be repeated. So here we have our answer. The judgment for the living is indeed the last message, but within that last message, there are more messages and more truths. Since the rod message only claimed to be the first angel's message for the judgment for the living, we are not to be both expecting and looking, or are we not to be both expecting and looking for more messages of truth within the umbrella of the judgment for the living? Do you understand what's being said here? That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? I'd say that's fairly straightforward. So we'll move on to our next section. These references here in this list are just generally speaking of the shepherd's rod being the last message in a general sense. And it's statements like this: mercy is knocking at the door for the last time, or saying this is referring to the message as the last rescue effort. So as you can see, and if you go and examine these statements, which you have on the screen here, you can see that they are not tying it to a particular context or a reason for saying that it's the last message. You're just speaking of it in general terms, like, mercy is knocking at the door for the last time, or this is the last rescue effort. So what we're going to do is look at very similar statements in the writings of Ellen G. White, And we're going to have to ask ourselves, if we are going to be consistent with ourselves and honest with our interpretation, we'd have to, understand the writings of Ellen White in a certain way, and the writings of Victor Houteff. If he's using the same terminology, we'd have to have a consistent interpretation of that terminology, not just trying to fit our preconceived notions. So here are some statements from Ellen White. She says, "I have been instructed that it is not extravagant display which is now required in giving the last message of mercy to our world." So notice here that she also said that she was then, presently, giving the last message of mercy to the world. And she also says the last message of mercy is being given to the world, present tense. You are giving the last message of warning to the world, are giving, present tense. So where's the room here for there being another message following her? In 1888 Materials, page 1148, paragraph 1, it says, "There are those who must be qualified for the work to be done now in bringing the last message of warning to all cities and in all towns in all parts of our world." And again, she says, we have the last message of mercy, or last message of warning, the last call of mercy. So all these things are given in present tense. So these quotations and many more show that the third angel's message was called the last message. Notice here as well that all the above quotations are, of course, present tense, as we just pointed out, and she was speaking of them then presently sounding the last message of warning. So here's a few other statements, and I'm asking, for those of you who are Adventists out there and are not Davidians watching this video, these statements may be the statements that are holding you back from accepting the shepherd's rod message. Now I'm going to ask you Davidians as well, if you are going to interpret the statements that we have seen from Victor Houteff in the way that Adventists are interpreting these statements, do you have any reason to say that these Adventists are misinterpreting these statements? Or are you not justifying them in their interpretation? In other words, if you're reading these statements where Victor Houteff generally says this is the last rescue effort, this is the last, we're giving the last message, this message is the last, if you're interpreting them in that way, aren't you giving Adventist justification for interpreting this message or these statements from Ellen White to say that there's no more truth and no more prophets after her, if you're going to interpret the statements from Victor Houteff in the same way? It's something to really consider, because, how are you going to explain this to a Seventh-day Adventist? When a Seventh-day Adventist reads a statement like this, in Review and Herald, January 19, 1905, paragraph 22, "We have, as John had, a message to bear of the things which we have seen and heard." God is not giving us a new message. We are to proclaim the message that in 1843 and 1844 brought us out of the other churches. We need the Holy Spirit to kindle in our hearts the zeal and earnestness that we were then seen among God's people. I thank the Lord that there are still living a few who can remember those days and who know whereof I speak. So my question is to a Davidian, if an Adventist reads this to you and says, well, she says here so clearly that God is not going to give us a new message, how can I accept the shepherd's rod message when Ellen White says so clearly that God isn't going to give us a new message? How are you going to explain that? Really think about this. Think about it. And actually just picture yourself in that situation. What will be your answer? Really think about it. And I'm going to read another statement, and then we're going to think about it some more. This is from Testimonies 5, page 206, paragraph 3. The third angel of Revelation 14 is represented as flying swiftly through the midst of heaven, crying, "Here are they that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus." Here is shown the nature of the work of the people of God. They have a message of so great importance that they are represented as flying in the presentation of it to the world. They are holding in their hands the bread of life for a famishing world. The love of Christ constrained them. This is the last message. There are no more to follow. No more invitations of mercy to be given after this message shall have done its work. What a trust! What a responsibility is resting upon all, and notice is present tense, all to carry the message to the to carry the words of the gracious invitation. The Spirit and the bride say, "Come," and let him that heareth say, "Come," and let him that is athirst come, and whosoever will, let him take the water of life freely. So notice here, she says so clearly in reference to the third angel's message that it is the last message and there are no more to follow. No more. No more messages to follow. And she says also, God is not giving us a new message. So I'm just asking for you Davidians, if a Seventh-day Adventist presents these quotations and the quotations that we saw above to you, what will be your answer? And really think about it. What will be your answer? And I'm not saying that to say that you don't have an answer. I know that you have an answer. A good answer. And it's the true answer because, as we can see in the Bible itself, in the Bible itself, it shows that there will be more messages. And Ellen White also points to more messages to come and more truth, right? But I'm asking you to think about what your answer is. Now, I'm going to also ask you, does not that same answer also apply to the statements where Victor Houteff says that the shepherd's rod message is the last? And if it doesn't, why? So really consider this, contemplate it, pray about it. For Davidians that think that there is no more truth, messages, or prophets to be given till the kingdom, please carefully consider the above statements. How will you explain this to Adventists who may ask? Will you not explain to them that indeed the message of the investigative judgment is the last, but that there are more than one section to that message? To say otherwise would contradict all that the above statements say. The other extreme would be to take the above statements at surface value and say that there are no more messages or prophets to come after Ellen White. Is this not exactly what is being done by the majority of Davidians with the statements from Victor Houteff? Please prayerfully consider. So, is not that the answer that Victor Houteff gave, where we saw in Jezreel letter number 2, paragraphs 1 and 2, page 1, paragraphs 1 and 2, where he explained it just like that to the Adventists? He said, the message of the investigative judgment, the message which started the denomination, is the last message. But within that message, we have multiple sections. And as we saw, even those sections have multiple sections. So isn't that the answer that he gave? Isn't that logical and reasonable? Anyways, we'll continue to the next section. There's only a couple statements here, but these two references basically say that the rod message is the last in the context of the call to the supper in Luke 14. And from everything that you've seen above so far, at this point, that really shouldn't even faze you because you can understand what is being said from everything that we've seen so far in this presentation. So, we have a couple more statements that say that the rod is the last in the sense of being the seventh in the context of Ezekiel 4. And there's a far more lengthy presentation that I also have in this regards, which I will likely do a video on at some point, likely sometime soon, and that will give a far more detailed and thorough answer to the question. But in here, I'm sure that this will satisfy the candid mind. So in the light of all the information we have seen so far, the rest of this should be very easy to understand. The shepherd's rod message is indeed the next truth given after the spelt of Ezekiel 4, with the exception of the 1888 message. However, this does not mean that there cannot be more truths to be given that are part of a further stage of the Davidian message. In fact, a look through the writings of Victor Houteff will reveal that, I put with, should be will, reveal that there is more truth that is part of the message which is not published. Shepherd's Rod, Volume 2, page 11. Each of these subjects could be greatly enlarged, but had we done so, this volume would have become too voluminous, also less comprehensive. Thus, we have omitted many details. Tract 1, First Edition, page 40. This article could have been greatly enlarged, and for brevity, all has been omitted, but that which will serve to introduce the message that is pleading at the doors of God's dear church. May the Lord have mercy on all of us. Tract 6, page 31. A world of butter-producing milk. These noble creatures, given such a volume of milk that we are give such a volume of milk that we are compelled to separate the cream. This is, of course, in the context of the young cow and two sheep. Separate the cream and are able to dispense only it. The milk we preserve. This plenitude bespeaks our being blessed with such a fullness of truth, milk, that all we can do is to send out the high points, the butter or cream. Revealed truth never before having amassed itself into such an inexhaustible store as it has today, completes the evidence that the interpretation of this prophecy is correct, and that the shepherd's rod, which contains the truth for this time, has caused the land to flow with milk and honey. Notice that he's saying that there are many more aspects of truth which are not published in the rod message, because he's just trying to bring out the high points. So these statements and many others let us know that there is more truth in relation to the judgment for the living that was not published in Victor Houteff's day. Furthermore, it should be noted that in Ezekiel 4, the second angel's message, the midnight cry, and the 1888 messages are not included. In other words, they're not included in that prophecy, so just because another message may not be specifically pointed out in that prophecy, that does not exclude its existence. And also, since we saw that all the messages of the judgment for the living are to be repeated, and Victor Houteff only brought the first angel's message for the judgment for the living, should we not expect the other messages to follow, even if they're not specifically delineated in Ezekiel 4? Also, that the perfect fulfillment of Ezekiel's 430-year prophecy was still future from the dates given by VTH. This is understood clearly when we notice that he always said that the dates he gave were not definite. And this aspect is the aspect that we will get into in a lot more detail in future studies. So, Shepherd's Rod, Volume 2, page 275. You will also note on page 222 that the 430 prophetic years originally applied to Abraham and his seed overlap the 430 of Ezekiel 4. The 430 years of Ezekiel should terminate in 1929 or 1930, but the perfect fulfillment of the prophetic period of Abraham in its antitype is yet in the future, going out of Egypt. Notice he's writing this in 1932. He published this after 1929-1930, and he says the perfect fulfillment of the 430 years is yet future. The chart on page 112 and 113 shows its termination in 1930, for as we stated before, it is outlined by the coincidences which perfectly fit the prophecy of Ezekiel. As it is impossible to make a time chart without any date to go by, we have used these coincidences, and it is stated that the date is indefinite. Did you notice what he just said? He said we just use these dates because you can't make a time chart without dates. So we used these coincidences. And it is stated that the date is indefinite. In other words, he's not trying to say, oh, that's it. That's the end of it. So see chart on page 133 of the second volume of the Shepherd's Rod. Ezekiel's prophecy is intended to point forward to the announcement of the predicted Reformation and the one through Abraham to its completion. Ezekiel 9. Shepherd's Rod, Volume 1, page 155. Notice something interesting here. Isaiah 62, verse 2. A new name, indicative of a new experience they have passed through, which is the separation or sifting, as explained. God himself, with his own mouth, gives the name so it cannot be counterfeited. The time the name is received is at the end of the 430-year period, as explained on the chart on pages 112 and 113. Thus, the church is reorganized under a new name. The old name, being polluted, could no longer be retained. There is no one to go by the old name, for the ones who were not worthy of having the new name have perished under the figure of the 5 men with slaughter weapons in their slaughter weapons of Ezekiel 9. The name only remains for a curse. In Isaiah 65:15 we read, "And ye shall leave your name for a curse unto my chosen, for the Lord God shall slay thee, and call his servants by another name." The old order of beings being changed, the watchmen who were unfaithful have perished. Notice what he's putting at the end of the 430 years. In the understanding that he had in 1930, and 1929 as well, when he published Shepherd's Rod Volume 1, he's clearly saying that the new name will be revealed at the end of the 430 years. Was there any new name given in 1929 or 1930? Some Davidians might try and say, well, yeah, Davidian is the new name. But remember that the name Davidian was not given until 1942. The name Davidian wasn't even known. And even the concept of Davidian, because that's dealing with the Davidic kingdom, and that wasn't even revealed until the end of 1936, beginning of 1937. So there's a few things here to consider. What is he saying here? Is the concept true? Is the concept true that at the end of the 430 years the new name is to be received? And here he's even talking about that being the beginning of Ezekiel 9. So what's happening here? I want you to really consider this. And like I said, we will go into this in more detail at another time. The only reason why somebody would try to use Ezekiel 4 to say that there is no more truth to come after Victor Houteff died is because it is said that the rod is the 7th truth in the line of Ezekiel 4. Even if we were to ignore all the evidence given above, the fact still remains that just because something is the 7th does not mean that there is no more truth. For many things that are the 7th have more than one stage. The Sabbath has the dark part and the light part. The 7th seal has the part before the half-an-hour silence and the part after it. The 7th beast, scarlet-colored, has the part before the 1,000 years and the part after it. The seventh trumpet has the part before the final close of probation and the part after it. The seventh church, SDA, has the part before it's purified and the part after it's purified. And the list goes on and on. I think by now you can see the picture that the message of the judgment for the living, though it is the last, seventh, there is more than one stage to it. To obtain more information, and etc., etc., this is what I was talking about before, about there being more information in regards to the 430 years. So now here's a few statements referring to the last message to the world. And if you read them, you'll see that the quotations have little to do with the issue at hand, and therefore will not be discussed in this particular study. So you can go and check that out. Now, these statements refer to the rod message as being the last message before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, before the judgment for the living, the harvest, and in that context it's also referring to the rod message as being the latter rain, which, if you know the Davidian message, you know it's the latter rain is the message which ripens the grain for the harvest. So obviously it's the last message before the harvest. So that's what all these statements are saying contextually. So this section, like the others, is really quite simple. The rod in the above quotations claims to be the last message before the commencement of the judgment for the living, which is the harvest, also termed the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And I'm going to say those claims are totally true, just as all the claims that we've seen so far. The reason given in some of the above quotations is that it is the latter rain, ripening the grain for the harvest. We just need to ask now, when does this harvest, judgment for the living, begin? And is there more truth to come when it does begin? So this hopefully is a point where you'll learn a few new things in relation to the harvest and the work of the shepherd's rod message as it pertains to the harvest. So this is Symbolic Code Volume 1, number 9, page 8. It is impossible for the action of separation to precede the action of judgment. In the very nature of things, the judgment must take place before the separation. Thus, the separation which was determined during the investigative judgment is executed after the actual judging is over. This is in perfect harmony with Testimonies to Ministers, page 234, which says, "The time of judgment is a most solemn period when the Lord gathers his own from among the tares." I want you to notice something here. Victor Houteff is clearly pointing out that first you have the investigation, which is the first stage of the judgment for the living, after which you have the separation. First you have the investigation, then you have the sentence, and then the execution of that sentence. And notice the claim that the shepherd's rod message had was that it is the last message before the judgment for the living begins. And when the judgment for the living begins, what does it begin with? Well, according to this statement, it begins with an investigation. So in other words, he's not claiming that the shepherd's rod message is the last message before the destruction of the tares, before the tares in the church die, literally. He's saying that the shepherd's rod message is the last before the investigative judgment for the living commences. So it begins with a investigation. In other words, we'll be in the judgment for the living before the actual destruction of the wicked in the church happens. And he's saying that his message is the last before that investigation begins. I hope that is clear, and we'll see that very clearly as we continue on. Tract 3, page 46 to 48. In graphic demonstration that he will come to the earth with all his angels to execute judgment upon the living, the Lord revealed himself prophetically to Ezekiel as being brought enthroned to earth by 4 living creatures just before the slaughter of the hypocrites in the church takes place. And as each of the living creatures has the face of a lion, the face of a calf, the face of a man, and the face of an eagle, Ezekiel 1:10, the same judicial insignia as have the beasts who are before the throne in the heavenly sanctuary, Revelation 4:7, in the time of the judgment of the dead, and as they descend to earth, they thereby symbolically show that the work of the mediatorial judicial throne, which convenes and presides over the judgment of the dead, is extended to earth. This extension, so far as we are able to know, must take place at the opening of the 7th seal, Revelation 8:1. For at that time the celestial voices which opened the judgment of the dead cease in the heavenly sanctuary and begin, after the half-an-hour silence, to sound on earth. In other words, just as in heaven at the opening of the judgment for the dead there will be lightnings and thunderings and voices, Revelation 4:5, likewise on earth at the opening of the judgment for the living there will be voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake, Revelation 8:5. With the judgment of the dead, however, the work of separation takes place in the books in the heavenly sanctuary, whereas with the judgment of the living, the separation takes place among the people in the church as well as among their names in the books in the heavenly sanctuary, thus showing that both sanctuaries will finally be cleansed. Inseparably, therefore, the Lord's coming to his temple, Malachi 3:1-3, his coming with all his angels, Matthew 25, and his coming enthroned above the living creatures, Ezekiel 1, all representing the same event, as has been shown, take place at the beginning of the judgment of the living, the time in which the judicial activities of the heavenly sanctuary extend to the earthly sanctuary, the church. It'd be good to reflect on that statement a little bit. Notice that he's saying that this extension that is described in Ezekiel 1 is showing that the mediatorial judicial activities of the investigative judgment in the heavenly sanctuary extend to the earthly sanctuary, the church. In other words, this takes place at the beginning of the investigation. And he says that that is the beginning of the judgment for the living. So in other words, the judgment for the living begins with an investigation. And notice he said that that's the same as Malachi 3:1-3 and Matthew 25, the Lord coming with all his angels. Please especially read Malachi 3, because it says that's when the Lord comes to purify the sons of Levi, and he's a swift witness against his people. Being a swift witness, what does that mean? He's speaking against them, bearing a testimony against them. So clearly he's not killing them right away in Malachi 3. First there's an investigation. And if you'd like to know more about Malachi 3 and the events that transpire at the beginning of the judgment for the living, please let me know and I can send you information concerning the prophecy of Ezekiel 5, which follows Ezekiel 4 and describes the events of the judgment for the living, which take place at the end of the 430 years of Ezekiel 4. So we're gonna continue on here and see more of the context in which Victor Houteff uses these statements. Timely Greetings, Volume 1, Number 3, page 13. Ezekiel 9 pictures the judgment of the living in the house of God, 1 Peter 4:17, the sealing of the saints, and the destruction of the wicked in the church. So notice he's including the sealing as part of the judgment of the living in the house of God. Something to consider. Jezreel Letter, number 1, page 4. For some time now you have had the 11th hour publications, tracts and timely greetings postmarked Waco, including a copy of the 1950 General Conference Special and the White House Recruiter, all bearing the light of God so direly needed at this climactic hour of time. The long-expected message of the sealing of the 144,000, the purification of the church, judgment of the living in the house of God, the message to the Laodiceans. Notice here that he is not using this phrase, the sealing of the 140,000, as a separate phrase from the purification of the church, the judgment for the living in the house of God, and the message to the Laodiceans. He's not saying sealing of the 140,000, comma, purification of the church, comma, judgment of the living in the house of God, comma, message to the Laodiceans, comma, as a list of separate things. He's not doing that at all. In fact, you can see that he's not doing that because he puts the phrases that I just mentioned in parentheses, and then as another separate item puts the loud cry, and then another separate item, kindred events. So you can see that he's saying that the sealing of the 140,000 is equated with the purification of the church and the judgment of the living. So this is just to show that the judgment begins in the sealing time of the 140,000, in the time of investigation, not with a destruction. Answer Book, Volume 2, page 41. That part of the investigative judgment of the living, by which is determined who are to have their sins blotted out, and as a result be given eternal life, is paralleled on earth by the work of an angel with the writer's inkhorn, who is charged to mark, seal, everyone who sighs and cries for all the abominations in Judah and Israel, the church, and the work of the 5 others who follow on to slay all who have not the mark, seal, is paralleled in heaven by the blotting out of the sinners' names from the book of life. See Ezekiel 9, etc., etc. Thus we see that this dual prophetic work of separating the names of the sinners from the names of the righteous in the sanctuary, and separating the names of the righteous in the church, is the same as the work decreed in the parables, separating the tares from the wheat, the bad fish from the good, those who have not the wedding garment from those who have it, those who have not improved their talents from those who have. So notice something here. He's saying that this work of marking in the earthly sanctuary is paralleled by the investigative judgment for living in the heavenly sanctuary. Again showing the same thing that the previous statements showed us, that the judgment for the living begins before the slaughter and basically as an investigation. These statements, more besides, all show as plain as day that the judgment for the living actually begins before the slaughter of the unrepentant in the church. The quotation we are dealing with in this section says that the rod is the last message before the judgment for the living. Notice that, not before the slaughter, before the judgment for the living. Now please consider the following quotations which tell us what to expect when the judgment for the living begins. Notice that. He clearly was putting it as something yet future, the judgment for the living, something which his message preceded, and that when it begins, the judgment for the living, it's before the slaughter. Now what does he say is going to happen when it begins? So that'd be between when he gave his message and when the slaughter takes place. Answer Book, Volume 2, page 92. As the anger of the nations is in the time of the judgment of the living, the loud cry of the third angel's message, the anger, is obviously directed against God's people, not against the nations themselves. Obvious is this fact because the nations among themselves have always been angry and are angry even today, although we are still in the time of the judgment of the dead. So notice, first he's saying, hey look, we're still in the judgment for the dead. So it had not begun in his day. Timely Greetings, Volume 2, number 11, page 12. Now what is the difference between the oil in the lamp and the oil in the vessel? Just this, the oil that is in the lamp that already lightens the traveler's path toward the master's mansion must represent truth in progress. But the oil in the vessel must represent truth that is to lighten one's path after the former truth has accomplished its work. For example, after the harvest, investigative judgment of the dead, is past, other truths, even more important, must be introduced for the harvest of the living. I say more important truths because they concern the living themselves, concern those whose own cases are to be weighed in the balances, those who personally are to be judged either as wheat or as tares, either as good fish or as bad fish. So notice, he's saying at the beginning of the judgment for the living, when the judgment for the dead is past, which he said had not yet taken place, when the judgment for the dead is past and the judgment for the living begins, new truths must be introduced. Do you get the concept here? With everything that we've seen so far, we've clearly seen a consistent testimony in the rod message that the judgment for the living begins with an investigation prior to the slaughter of the wicked in the church, but yet after his day. So he's saying that after his day and before the slaughter, there's to be a time when the judgment for the living begins and new truths are introduced. So these statements themselves prove that when the judgment for the living begins, before the slaying, the Lord must introduce other truths even more important. Now for the Lord to introduce new truths, how will he do this? Well, of course, Amos 3:7. We know what Amos 3:7 says, don't we, as Davidians? Which brings us to the last section here. We have these statements here, which, as you can see, aren't that many. And these are the statements, all the statements in the rod, which say that Elijah is the last prophet. So with the information presented thus far, each individual needs to honestly ask himself or herself what all these statements are saying. So far we have found that there is to be more truth introduced before the destruction of the wicked in the church. We also know from the rod message that no new truth can come except through a prophet. However, the above references make it quite clear that Elijah is the last prophet. As Davidians, we also understand that VTH claimed the title of Elijah. Let us consider a few things. And of course, this seems like a blatant contradiction. It seems like something that is, you just can't get past it, To me, at one point, it seemed like, these statements that we're about to read seemed to me to be so powerful to say that there can just be no more prophets after Victor Houteff. But today, I'm seeing something very different. And really, please consider these things, because can't you honestly say, as you consider the information that we've seen so far in this presentation, the case to say that the rod message is the last is weak at best. Haven't we seen a context here? Haven't we seen what Victor Houteff was really putting forward? And that if we interpret his statements in that way, it does not hold up with the rest of his message and with other statements from Ellen White. So as we continue on, please consider all these things and keep an open mind. General Conference Special, page 8. Do not, though, forget that the message which he, referring to Elijah, proclaims will in itself bear the divine credentials of truth, and that no priest or prelate can decide for you who Elijah may or may not be. No, not even the appearance of what his message is doing or not doing, or whatever is whatever it is, whether it is prospering, or whether it is prospering or disintegrating, can be taken as evidence that God is in it. Neither can numbers of adherents, for such have never signified a right cause at any time, not even in the day Christ himself preached the gospel of the kingdom. The message he brings is the only thing to go by. For this reason, the prophet, or the message, is called Elijah. And that's Shepherd's Rod, Volume 1, page 47, says, the prophet or the message is called Elijah. What most of us as Davidians are doing is making the birth certificate part of the test in addition to the message. What I mean by this is that if the person's birth certificate does not say Victor Houteff, we will automatically reject that person as being Elijah. But if the prophet or the message is called Elijah, how do we justify judging it by anything other than the message itself? Here's an example that we can all understand. So please pay careful attention to this. The Shepherd's Rod message in various places, references shown, places Ellen White as the antitypical Moses. However, it elsewhere, and even in the same places, tells us that Victor Houteff and the Rod message are Moses. References seen in front of you. So what we find is that in the type, there was one prophet, but in the antitype, the title of Moses was first on one prophet, then later transferred to another. What is the key to this? The message. Both Ellen White and Victor Houteff had a message that was typified by Moses and his rod. Do you notice that? Moses, there was to be an antitypical Moses and work of Moses, message of Moses, etc. Victor Houteff, in these statements, places that on Ellen White, but in these statements, places it on himself. So, what do we have? There was one Moses, and all of a sudden it's being fulfilled in two prophets. What's the key? Well, of course, their message, right? They were both, their work and message both fits the role of Moses. And, of course, more specifically, the Shepherd's Rod message. So, we'll see. Another key to this is found in the following quotation. And this is a very important one. I ask you please to read the whole thing. And I guess we're probably going to do so now because it's important enough. Symbolic Code, Volume 1, Number 4, pages 4 to 6. Please explain how to summarize the Shepherd's Rod, Volume 2, page 240, paragraph 2, with Gospel Workers, page 42, paragraph 2. The subject, the messenger of the covenant. To the surface reader, the Shepherd's Rod and Gospel Workers appears to be in direct opposition to each other, but when the subject is well studied, then they will be found to be in perfect agreement. Such apparently conflicting statements are not found only in these two publications, but in Gospel Workers itself. For while Christ is named the messenger of the covenant on page 44, the same title is applied to Moses on page 20. Here follows the comparison. And please pay careful attention to each of these statements, and where I have it highlighted, it's highlighted for a reason. When Moses was chosen as the messenger of the covenant, the word given him was, "Be thou for the people to Godward." Christ, the messenger of the covenant, brought the tidings of salvation. If we conclude that the Shepherd's Rod is wrong by saying that the promised Elijah's message, notice the promised Elijah's message of Malachi 4:5 is the messenger of the covenant, and that Gospel Workers for applying the same title to both Christ and Moses, then we might as well infer that Christ likewise misapplied the same scripture, for Jesus began to say unto the multitudes concerning John, "But what went ye out to see? A prophet? Yea, I say unto you, and more than a prophet, for this is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare thy way before thee. And if ye shall receive it, this is Elias, which was for to come." Here we see that Jesus applied the message of Malachi 3 to that of John the Baptist, and named him Elijah that was to come. But when the Jews, priests, and Levites asked Jesus, Art thou Elias? He saith, I am not. Shall we conclude that both Jesus and John violated the truth? What then? Moreover, the gospel workers applies Malachi 3:1 to Christ's first advent, but the same author in Great Controversy, page 424, paragraph 3, applies it to Christ's coming to both the most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary in 1844, and on page 2 or 425 it's applied to the soon expected purification of the church. Again, on page 426, the author states that Daniel 8:14, the coming of the Son of Man to the Ancient of Days, as presented in Daniel 7:13, and the coming of the Lord to his temple foretold by Malachi are descriptions of the same event. And this is also represented by the coming of the bridegroom to the marriage described by Christ in the parable of the 10 virgins of Matthew 25. If only one of these applications could be right, then which one should we choose? When the questioner harmoniously unifies the above